A traditional high-end audio system consists of boxes, lots of boxes. In addition to the speakers, you might have a preamplifier, an amplifier or two, a DAC, but the product I'm looking at today, the JBL 4329P Studio Monitor Powered Loudspeaker, combines all of those components and more into two modestly sized cabinets. Does it also deliver the sonic goods? Let's find out. I'm Jenkins, and here on the Absolute Sounds YouTube channel, I review audio products that are affordable, appeal to those of us who listen to music in real-world, often shared spaces, or both. And despite its $4,500 price tag, plus an additional $400 for the optional JS80 stands, I think the JBL 4329P arguably falls into both categories. For that argument to make sense, let's look at what you get for the money, which is roughly on par with the combined price tags of the NAD C389 integrated amplifier and the Paradigm Premier 700F floor standing speakers I've reviewed in the past. The 4329P is an active design, with each speaker cabinet featuring a 1-inch horn compression driver driven by a 50-watt amplifier and an 8-inch woofer with 2 ports on the front driven by a separate 250-watt amp. Also included are a 24-bit 192Hz high-res DAC, and, on the back of the main speaker, mini plug and XLR analog inputs, optical, Toslink, and USB-B digital inputs, and an Ethernet input. There's also a subwoofer output crossed over at 80 Hz, and an Ethernet output used to physically tether the two speakers together. The latter is not required because you can wirelessly connect the two speakers, although resolution will then be limited to 2496, and more important, in both cases, the speakers just sound better hardwired, meaning that your entire audio system could conceivably consist of just the two speakers, their power cords, and your phone or computer. Obviously, there's built-in connectivity for Chromecast, AirPlay 2, and Bluetooth app decks as well. So at most, all you would ever need to add is a source component or two. Anyway, in terms of size, the 4329P stands about 20 inches high, is a little over a foot wide and deep, and each one weighs around 35 pounds. When mounted on the JS80 stands, the speaker is about 3 feet high, but it's far less intrusive than a floor-standing speaker of the same dimensions. And for whatever reason, this speaker, unlike every other component I've ever had in the house, immediately drew favorable comments about its appearance. My 15-year-old son, for example, said, "You finally got a good-looking speaker." But features and looks are one thing, sound is a whole other category. So does the JBL live up to its price tag and the promise of its hardware?
Just a brief interruption, esteemed viewers. I'm Tom Martin, Chief Content Officer of the Absolute Sound. I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the Absolute Sound magazine, which we've been publishing for over 50 years. For $20 per year in print, or $10 per year in digital magazine format, you get 11 issues, each with around 100 pages of exclusive equipment reviews, music reviews, and buyer's guides. You also get early access to our 3 awards issues: Editor's Choice, Products of the Year, and Golden Ear. To subscribe, enter this URL in your browser or go to theabsolutesound.com and click on the subscribe button. Thanks, and now back to the show.
Connecting the JBLs to my network, and then my phone and computer to the JBLs, was straightforward. It took maybe 5 minutes until I was able to stream Airplane 2 from my iPhone. So it's all very easy to use, but to me it sounded like music streaming off a phone usually does, flat and unengaging. The JBLs did sound fine streaming Bluetooth from my television, where critical listening isn't really an issue. And for that use, these were easily the best pair of speakers I've had in my room, for reasons I'll touch on later. For serious music listening, I quickly switched to streaming high-res digital. I tested the JBL's USB input, which sounded much better than AirPlay 2, but my primary source was the NAD C389, which I used as a Dirac room-corrected tidal streaming preamp feeding the JBL's mini plug analog input. This isn't ideal since the JBL digitizes all incoming analog signals, but in my room, the improvement in sound quality far outweighed any possible sonic compromise caused by an extra analog to digital conversion. And one quick aside, the 4329P doesn't have an external volume display, so until you press play or drop the needle, you don't necessarily know just how loud it's going to start playing. Fair warning. So, the first thing you need to know is that the 4329P sound is big and bold, open and powerful. The JBLs throw a wide soundstage and hit you with very deep, very solid bass. Despite the speaker's relatively small size, they regularly produced bass notes I could feel in my chest. Hip-hop, rap, and electronica were small-scale epic, if nowhere near 12-inch subwoofer levels of boom, as were the kick drums in rock and jazz and everything from kettle drums to cannon fire in classical music. But for all the volume and potential impact, the bass was always tight and controlled with no overhang, no bloat. And instruments like the stand-up bass and bass guitar were nicely textured, their lines easy to follow in the background of the music. If there's too much bass in your room, on the back of the main speaker is a bass contour switch, which allows you to reduce bass output by 3 decibels. I use the switch in my room after I push the speakers further away from the main listening position and closer to the front wall to gain a little breathing room. Because the 4329P's horn tweeters have a very forward, very prominent flavor. And this is a stereotypical characteristic of horn tweeters, and it's simply a matter of personal preference, what you think of it. It's energetic rather than relaxed, which is definitely enjoyable in some cases, but does bring out the worst in bright recordings. It can also get tiring during long listening sessions. And speaker positioning plays a big role here. The illustration in JBL's owner's manual recommends a 30-degree toe-in toward the listening position, but if you go a little further and read the actual text, the company recommends 10 to 25 degrees, which works out much better. I ended up closer to 10 than 25, which both diminished that forward sound and widened the sound stage. And I've never heard an orchestra so spread out in my room. If forwardness is a potential downside of the horn tweeter, one potential upside is imaging, which the 4329Ps do very well. Inside that big sound stage, instruments and singers and effects are laid out very precisely. On Pink Floyd's Shine On You Crazy Diamond, parts 1 through 5, drummer Nick Mason plays all his drums in a sequence from left to right, and I could clearly hear the different location of each drum as it was struck, and those drums were farther apart than ever before thanks to the width of the soundstage. Similarly, the various pipes of a pipe organ were in audibly different locations, and of course the clocks and other effects on time from Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon were spread out far and wide in space. Imaging wasn't the tweeter's only strength. If cymbals sometimes shimmered a touch too much through the JBLs, their decay was nicely realistic, the ringing slowly and steadily fading away into an airy silence. And despite JBL's description of this speaker as a studio monitor, it doesn't sound like that breed of intentionally neutral and revealing speakers. Instead, it's a little bright and, on the right recordings, has a really smooth mid-range that accurately recreates the tone and pitch of voices and instruments. I thought the speakers showed off their best with classical and orchestral music, with burnished brass and soulful strings really delivering impressive musical depth and feeling. Overall, I think the JBL 4329Ps are a real success. They're good value given how many separate components they replace. They don't take up too much space in your room, and in terms of sound, well, weeks after they went back to JBL, I still miss their low-end performance, big open sound stage, and effortless dynamic swings. Setting up the JBLs is pretty straightforward, connectivity options are extensive, and when it comes to simplicity and visual cleanliness, it's hard to beat 2 speakers and as few as 2 cables, maybe 3. You can place the speakers close to a wall to get them out of the way, and hit that bass contour button if you need less bass in your room. And, as I mentioned earlier, the JBLs were easily the best speakers I've had in my room for doing double duty with a television, thanks in part to their ability to very clearly render dialogue. All that said, the JBLs won't be the right speaker for everyone, and that's due mostly to that forward sound of the horn tweeters. But since there's no way to know how you'll feel about it unless you hear it, I highly, highly recommend auditioning the 4329Ps.